Hi, welcome to the Tech Mojo. This is Nilan, and in today's video, we will learn about creating and using interceptors in Spring Boot. This video is broken down into multiple chapters. In chapter 1, we will talk about introduction to Spring Interceptors with some real-time use cases. And in chapter 2, we will talk about difference between the Spring Interceptors and servlet filters. The chapter 3 will cover how to implement and register an interceptors in Spring Boot. In chapter 4, we will discuss about the interceptor execution order, especially when you have multiple interceptors. In chapter 5, we will create an interceptor to perform the basic authentication checks for the incoming HTTP request. Now, without a further delay, let's get started. Spring interceptors are used to intercept the client request before they are handled by the controller. They can also be used to intercept the response before the response is sent back to the client. Interceptors are part of Spring Web MVC framework, and they provide a way to add pre- and post-processing logic to your application request-response lifecycle. Interceptors can be used to log the HTTP request and response, and this can be useful for debugging or tracking the performance of your application. Interceptors can also be used to enforce the security policy. For example, you can write an interceptor that would check the user is authenticated before allowing them access to the resources. Interceptors can be used to cache the HTTP request and response, and this can improve the performance of your application by reducing the number of times the request has to reach to the controller. Interceptors can also be used to transform your HTTP request and response. For example, an interceptor could be used to convert the JSON request to a XML response. In a typical Spring Boot REST API, whenever the client sends a HTTP request to a specific endpoint or to a specific REST API, the request is first received by the web server. And then the web server will forward the request to your Spring Boot application. The dispatcher servlet is the entry point for all the incoming requests in Spring Boot application. Once the dispatcher servlet receives the request, it consults with the URL handler mapping, and the handler mapping is responsible to determine which controller it should be passed to. The request is then passed to the controller, and it is passed to the controller based on the mapping that we define. Similar to interceptor, there is also another concept called filters. Now, the filters are part of Servlet API, and they are operating at a very low level. Filters can also be used to intercept your request and response. The only difference between the filter and interceptor is filters are not specific to the Spring framework. They are basically a part of Servlet API, and they are operating at a very low level. The filters are not specific to the Spring framework. However, you can still use the Servlet filter because the Spring application or Spring itself is built on top of Servlet API. So now basically in Spring Boot application, you have two options. You can either use filters or you can use interceptors, right? So how do you decide which one to use for your use case? If the task is specifically related to Spring MVC, which requires a Spring application context, then you should go with the interceptor. But if the task is more generic in nature and it does not require any Spring MVC or Spring context, then you should do that in a servlet level, and that can be done using the servlet filters. Now let's look into how servlet filters and interceptors are fit in within the application lifecycle. Now, whenever the request is made by the user, the request is now first reaching to the servlet filter, and then the request will be sent or forwarded to the dispatcher servlet, and then dispatcher servlet will send the request to the interceptor, and then after all the interceptors are executed, then it passed to the controller. In order to create an interceptor in Spring Boot, we typically have to create a class that implements the handler interceptor interface. The handler interceptor interface has three methods: the pre-handle, post-handle, and after completion. The pre-handle method is executed before the actual controller method is called. It returns a Boolean value. Boolean true indicates that whether the request would continue to go to the controller or it should be stopped right here. The post handle method is executed after the controller method is called, but before the response is sent to the client. So this is where you typically do any post-processing logic like modifying your response header or modifying your response content. The after completion method is called after the request has been completed, and this method is called even if there is an exception was thrown during the processing of your request. Typically, you can use the after completion method to perform any cleanup task that you need to do after the request has been completed. Now that we understand the basics about interceptors and how it works, let's jump straight into our Spring Boot application and we will see it in action. For the demonstration purpose, I've created a simple Spring Boot REST API, and this is a basic REST API which has a controller called product controller. And within the product controller, we have like two methods. The first method, which is get products. So the get products method is returning a hard-coded list of products. Again, we have another endpoint called post endpoint. So this post endpoint is mapped to the URL/new. And here we're not doing anything complex again. We're just passing a product as a request body, and we are returning the same object here. Now let's run this and see how this works in the Postman. Now, as you see, the hard-coded list of products are returned here. Now let's check on the next endpoint, which is the new endpoint. New, okay. And this should be a HTTP post, and it takes a body, which is a raw JSON. Okay, I mean, we're not doing any validation or anything whatsoever, right? So you're passing a JSON and that JSON is sent back to us. Okay, now as you see, the list method and the new method both are working. Now let's jump back to our Spring Boot application and try to implement an interceptor for intercepting or printing the logs. Now to create an interceptor, all you need is you need to create a class. So new Java class. So let's call this as log handler interceptor. Now your log handler interceptor need to implement the handler interceptor. Now if you go inside the handler interceptor, you can notice that there are three methods: the pre-handle, post-handle, and after completion. The pre-handle method returns a boolean value, true. If it returns a true, what it means is it will continue with your controller. Otherwise, the request flow will be stopped here. Now, all these three methods are implemented within your interface, and that implementation is done using the default keyword. And this is a new concept since Java 8, where you can have an implementation or method implementation within your interface. What this means is you're not forced anymore to implement any of these methods within your class. Okay, but however, let's go back to our class and we'll try to override all the three methods here. Okay. Now here, let's return true so that it will continue with our controller. Now here, all we need to do is we want to print the logs. We want to print the logs to identify or to understand the flow of execution. Now for that, I'm going to use the logger slf4j. Let me just use log.info. Here I'm printing the name of the class, so I know where the request is coming from, and pre-handle. Okay, let's do the similar things here for the post handle and for after completion. Now, once you have created the custom interceptor, the next thing we need to register it with the Spring Boot application. And the registration can be done using the Web MVC configurer configuration. Now for that, let's create another class, new Java class, and call this as web config. Now this web config must implement your Web MVC configurer. And let's declare this as a configuration so that your Spring Boot application know about it. Now here we need to override the add interceptors method from the Web MVC configurer. Okay, so let's override here, add interceptors. Okay. Now the add interceptor method provides you the interceptor registry. Now we need to add our interceptor to this registry. Okay, so all I did is registry.add interceptor, and then I'm creating an object of my interceptor. Okay, let's run this again. Okay, my application is started in port 8080. Let's clear the logs, go back here and hit the list. Now, as you see, the log handler interceptor pre-handle method is executed before the controller, and once the controller execution is complete, then it calls the post handle, and then finally the after completion method is called. Now, this is how you add an interceptor in Spring Boot. Now, let us extend this example to add a basic authentication check. Now, in order to do that, let's copy my log handler interceptor and I will paste it here, and let's call this as basic auth handler interceptor. Okay, and similarly I'll change these names as well. Okay, now let's call this as method, right? It sounds a bit weird. Do the same thing here. Okay, so now we have created a basic auth handler interceptor, but again, we're not doing anything at the moment. Let's verify how this works and which one executed first. Now we need to add the basic auth handler interceptor to the registry again, similar to what we did for log handler interceptor. Now it is added to the registry. Let's run it again. Now products list. So one thing to notice here is the first it prints the log handler interceptor pre-handle method, and then it goes to the basic auth handler interceptor. Once all the interceptors are executed, then it goes to the controller. Now when it is coming back from the controller, the first it executes the basic authentication handler, and then it prints the log handler interceptor. Okay, and finally it prints the after completion method, again in the same order as the post handle. Now what if we want to change the order? We want to execute the basic authentication before the log handler, and you can do that here by adding the order method here, and let's give the order as 1. What it means is the basic auth handler interceptor will be executed before the log handler interceptor. Okay, so here we give order 2. Now as you can see, the basic authentication handler interceptor is called before the log handler interceptor. Okay, and this is because we have specified the higher order for the basic authentication interceptor. Now what if you want to execute certain interceptor for a specific endpoint or specific URL? You don't want all your interceptor to be executed for all the time, right? So now let's say if you want to do that, we can do add path patterns, and here we need to specify let's say products/new. So what do you want is whenever we are hitting this endpoint, product/new endpoint, then the basic authentication interceptor should be executed. Okay, let's run that again. Now you see product list, when you hit that, it is not going to that interceptor at all. It is only printing the log handler interceptor, but if I go to my new endpoint, now you see the basic authentication interceptor is printed, and then it prints the log handler interceptor. Basically for the product/new endpoint, both the interceptors are executed. However, for the list endpoint, only the log handler interceptor is printed. Okay, so now let's expand this into doing the basic authentication check. Now what we want to do next is when somebody hitting this product/new endpoint, we want user to provide a username and password, and if they don't provide that authorization username and password, then they should not be allowed the service. So for that, you click on the authorization tab and here go for basic auth and enter your username and password. I'm adding admin and admin. Okay, so when you do this, okay, so right now the authorization headers has no impact or no effect because we haven't done anything yet. Now let's go back here on the code section. So one thing you notice here is the username and password that we are passing here is getting converted into base 64 and it has a specific format for it. All we need to do within our basic authentication interceptor is we need to extract this header and then we need to get this base 64 string, then convert that back into the username and password and then validate within our Java application. Okay, so for me, let's copy this and go back to my Java application. Let's paste it here for our reference. We can delete that later. So the first thing we need is let's create a constant username and password. Okay, so let's say private static final So I've created two constants. So this will be the hard-coded username and password we will use to validate our user. To keep this example simple, I'm not having any database operations here. So that's why we have created two constants and we will validate against these constants. Now the next thing we want is we want to extract this header, the authorization header. Now to do that, string auth header request.getHeader and you pass the header key. That's it. And once you have the authorization header, now the next thing you want to verify is the authentication header should not be empty and it should also be starting with a basic. Okay, so once it starts with that, the next thing we want is let's extract the base 64 string, which is this part. Okay, now you can do that using substring method. So base 64 credential equals to auth header dot substring, and here we can just give basic space this. Okay, so the next thing we need is we need to convert this base 64 into the plain text format, and for that we can use the Java utils base 64 package. Okay, this is the decoded credentials. Okay, now let's convert this byte credentials into a string format. Here you can optionally provide the encoding format, which is UTF-8. Okay, now what we will get at this point is we will get this getting converted into a plain text format, but when it is converted, by default it comes like this, like admin:admin. So the first part is going to be your username and the second part is going to be your password. Now let's split that and split that into two parts, and to do that let's use string part. Well, let's convert that into a string array, string parts. Okay, now these parts will have two values here. One is the first item will be the username and the second item is going to be the password. Now let's here put the conditional check if username dot equals parts of 0, okay, and password dot equals parts of 1. Okay, now if the username and password is correct, we want to continue with the controller, and that's why we will return true. Now here, in all other cases, it should return false. That means the controller should not be invoked. Now here we can also return an error message, and to return an error message, let's do response dot send error. Okay, so here let's use http response dot unauthorized. Okay, so this is all you need to do to create your basic authentication check. So all we did is first we extracted the authorization header, and then we are verifying that authorization header is not empty, or it should start with the basic. Then we are extracting the basic and space here, so it returns the base 64 credentials only. Then we are trying to convert the base 64 credentials back to the plain text here, and then we splitting, getting the username and password into two parts, and then we are validating the username and password provided by user with the username and password we have hard coded here. Okay, so we have created the basic authentication interceptor, and the interceptor is also being added to the registry already, so we don't have to do anything. Let's go and run it. Now go back again and try to hit new. Okay, it is returning 200. Okay, because we are passing the username as admin and password as admin, but let's change that to something else. Okay, so as you see, we are getting unauthorized error 401. Now this is all for today's video. If you have any questions about Spring Interceptors or any other related Spring concepts, please write down in the comment section below, and I'll try to respond as soon as possible. If you like this video and if you want to see similar videos in future, please like and subscribe my channel for more such contents. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.